Balaam prophesied relating to the Jewish people that the nation shall dwell alone and not be reckoned among the nations. Many see these words of Balaam as the formative statement of the relationship between the Jewish people and the nations of the world. Anti-Semitism, Israel's international isolation, are therefore the bitter fruit of destiny, foretold millennia ago. And one could argue that the laws of the Torah themselves have contributed to this separate status of the Jewish people, whether it's the keeping of Shabbos, whether keeping kosher, whether not intermarrying with people from other nations. All these have kept the Jewish people a nation apart. And this separateness is something which goes beyond even Jewish religiosity. We know that in America there are many ethnic groups. There are Italian Americans, there are Native Americans, there are Irish Americans. In all these groups, there are Americans that are, the adjective defining them is based on their ethnic group. The one exception are the Jews. We don't say Jewish Americans, but rather American Jews. That the Jews is the essential definition of who they are. And in Israel also, even non-religious Jews will talk about Israel as Haaretz, the land. And we'll talk about going outside of Israel as going to Chutz La'aretz, going out of the land. The world is divided into two, the land and out of the land. So certainly the separateness of the Jewish people is a reality that's been going on for thousands of years. However, one could argue exactly the opposite, that the Jewish people are not the nation most separated from humanity, but the nation most connected to humanity. From the very beginning, certainly the prophecies of Abraham as being a father of many nations, a source of blessings for nations, the status of the Jewish people in the book of Shemos as being a nation of priests relating to the world, and the visions of Yeshayahu as being a light to nations, certainly much of this has happened. That the Torah has given basic values to many nations, to many religions throughout the world, and even beyond Jews religiously impacting on the world. The Jewish people, many Jews who have been essential in changing the consciousness of humanity itself. Many of the Jews were not Jews who practiced Judaism, and many of their changes were for the worse and not for the better, but it's undisputable that Jews have had a tremendous impact on humanity, and in particular, humanity's conscience. If I would mention 5 Jews have changed the world, without connecting to Judaism, I would say Jesus, Marx, Einstein, Freud, and in our times, in the day of Facebook, we could add Zuckerberg. So we have 2 equations here. Jews being most separate or Jews being most connected to humanity. And sometimes it's really 2 sides of the same coin. On one hand, we could say Israel is isolated. But on the other hand, we could say that Israel is the nation most connected to other countries in the world, because the world is so fascinated with any and everything happening in Israel. So how can we get down, understand this riddle about being separate and being connected? I think the connection is that the very fact that God gave the Jewish people a special role relating to humanity, and part of the fulfillment of that role included the Jewish people being dispersed throughout the world, that special role towards humanity by definition gave a special status. And that special status is what led us to be separate from the rest of humanity. And that in fact might be the source of much of the anti-Semitism. I remember Rav Amital, the former Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, would tell the story about this small town in Eastern Europe that the gabbai of the synagogue before the holy days would go throughout the town to wake everybody up early in the morning for the special prayers in the morning. And the gabbai himself, he would spend the night cleaning up the synagogue, and then he'd go around the entire city waking everybody up. So when finally everyone would arrive for the prayer, the gabbai himself would be so exhausted that he himself would fall asleep. But when he fell asleep, the people came and started shoving him and pushing him to make sure, doing everything they can to make sure he wakes up. And he said, begged them, leave me alone. I was up the whole night. I worked so hard. Let me sleep. Let me rest. But their answer to him was, you woke us up. We're not going to let you to sleep. This special status, I think, was captured in the image of the Sefer Kuzari of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. The Kuzari pictures the nations of the world as different organs of the human body, and the Jewish people as being the heart. The heart interacts with the entire body. It receives and it gives, but the heart also has a special status within the body. And the Kuzari adds that the heart is the organ that has the most health and also the most sickness associated with it. As a source of health, we understand what is the meaning of the heart being most connected to sickness. Relating to heart, we know how sensitive the heart is, how dangerous it is when the heart is damaged. But I would take this analogy towards the Jewish people and point out that how in the last century there have been 3 movements that have threatened all of humanity. And the first victims of these 3 movements were the Jews. Communism, fascism, and now the extreme Islamic fundamentalism. 3 movements that are looking to dominate the world. And not by coincidence, I believe, all 3 of them, their first victims being the Jewish people. Somehow the Jewish people are a barometer of what's happening within the entire organism of humanity. And this special status also explains why many of the laws of history do not apply to the Jewish people. There was a famous historian, Arnold Toynbee, who composed a theory to explain how nations are formed and how nations ultimately dissolve. His theory was perfect, with one exception, that somehow it didn't explain the endurance of the Jewish people, which according to his theory should have disappeared thousands of years ago. The solution he found was to say that the Jewish people do not exist. We are a living fossil. And there was a famous debate at McGill University between Yaakov Herzog, the brother of the former president of Israel and son of the former chief rabbi of Israel, and who unfortunately untimely passed away. And in his book called A People That Dwell Alone, Herzog and Toynbee debated, do the Jewish people exist? And ultimately I think the answer is Toynbee is right. His rules for guiding history were correct. Just these rules just don't apply to the Jewish people. Let me end by mentioning some of the thought of the great 19th century Italian rabbi Elio ben Amozeg. Ben Amozeg was a major rabbi, but also a major Kabbalist, and central to his philosophy was the issue of the relationship between the Jewish people and the nations of the world. He wrote a book called Israel and Humanity. Although he was Italian, he wrote it not in Italian and not in Hebrew, but rather in French, believing that French is the language of the world. Ultimately, he tried to have it translated into English. There's even a letter preserved that he sent to President Cleveland asking explaining why it's important for his book to come out in English, but only decades later was it translated. And his book argues that there is a universal religion which is described in the context of what's called the 7 mitzvot of Bnei Noach, and the essential religion for the world is that religion. Judaism's role is to awaken in humanity the universal religion, and the separateness of the Jewish people is, had we not have all the laws that keep us separate, we would have disappeared long, long ago. So we need to stay separate to fulfill our mission. But our role is connected to humanity as a whole, being interconnected with them and hoping to bring them closer to the worship of God. And I'll end with Ben Mosai's understanding of the closing verse of the book of the prophets, which describes the message, the mission of Eliyahu Hanavi as bringing about a reconciliation of the fathers and the sons. And Ben Mosai says this is talking about the reconciliation of Judaism and the religions that emerged on the base of Judaism, the hope that ultimately these religions will come back to their roots, and the avot to the Benim, Judaism and those other religions will live in harmony together. Shabbat Shalom.